All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our meeting of the Montgomery County Chamber's Economic Development Committee. For those who don't know me, I'm Brian Levine. I do government affairs for the Chamber and also work on the committees. And as we do for all of our committee meetings, please note that we are recording this meeting. The Economic Development Committee meets several times a year, usually on the first Wednesday of most months. This is the first Wednesday of this month. Just a quick advertisement, if it's okay. Our next meeting is on May 3rd, and I'm still working on something for that one. So everyone stay tuned, but our regularly scheduled meeting would be May 3rd for this committee. We also, Ralph, have two other committees. One is our Legislative Affairs Committee, which has been meeting weekly during our legislative sessions. So we have a meeting tomorrow morning at 8:30 to discuss what's going on in Annapolis. And there's a lot going on the county level too. So if you want to join that, you can sign up on our website for that one at no cost. Our other committee, our Infrastructure and Land Use Committee, we have two meetings in the books for that one, April 20th and May 9th. Our April 20th meeting is with Council Member Andrew Friedson. And then on May 9th, we have WMATA CEO, General Manager and CEO Randy Clark. So if you're interested in those are also on our website. You can register for those. And also, I would be remiss if I did not let everyone know, just a reminder, our biggest event, our annual dinner is June 9th. So save the date for that one, and we hope to see you there. And I don't know if you want to do intros, or I can just ask everyone to put their name in the organization in their box here. One way to do that, if you're on our computers, you can click those three little dots up in the upper right-hand corner and hit rename in the menu, and you can rename yourself there. Or if you want to just do quick intros, up to you, Ann.
I think it'd be nice for Ralph to just kind of hear who's in the room. So maybe we can just go around real quickly and say name and affiliation. That'd be great. Yeah,
let me call out people as I see them on my screen so I don't mess it up. The first person I see, Terry, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
City of Tacoma Park on the City Council, Terry Siemens.
Thank you, Council Member. Bill?
Hi, Bill Wishman. I'm General Counsel for Kaiser Permanente. Nice to see you today.
And Ralph, Bill is also on our Board of Directors and is co-chair of our Legislative Affairs Committee. Steve? Steve Simon.
Steve Simon from the Universities at Shady Grove.
And Ralph, the person who will be one of the leaders of our Legislative Affairs Committee meeting tomorrow, John Steerhoff. John, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, John Steerhoff. I'm a partner at Venable LLP.
Stu?
Yeah, Stu Edelstein, former ED and USG, former member of the Chamber, actually co-chair of this committee. Glad to be here.
We're happy to have you, Stu. Lowell, Mr. Yoder.
Good morning, Lowell Yoder, M&T Bank. I'm also chair of the Montgomery County Chamber.
Gigi, you're next to my screen, but I would, if you want to introduce yourself again, Gigi is our president and CEO.
Good morning, President and CEO of the Chamber, and also it's June 8th for our annual dinner. We have so many dates in our head. It's hard to keep them all straight. Be there, be square though. I'm expecting, and I hope Ralph will join us as well.
I'm confident I got all the dates correct for my committee meeting.
You do absolutely have that. Thank you.
Tom, you're next.
Hey, good morning. Tom Clifford from the Universities at Shady Grove Advancement. Glad to be here.
Thanks for being here. Leslie Ford Weber.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Leslie Weber with Suburban Hospital Johns Hopkins, and with Bill, I co-chair the Legislative Affairs Committee. Nice to see you all. I may be off and on camera this morning too, so.
And a member of our Board of Directors, Ralph, of course. Susan, S-Madden iPad.
Yes, it's S. Madden iPad, or otherwise known as Susan Madden from Montgomery College. Thank you.
And Ralph, another member of our board. Anise, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. I'm Anise Cody with Holy Cross Health.
Thank you, Anise. Feezy.
Good morning, Feezy Halim, Montgomery College, Workforce Development and Continuing Education.
Ann Brooks.
Hi, good morning. Ann Brooks with Crown Castle. We build telecommunications infrastructure.
And one of my favorites, Mel. Mel, do you want to go next?
Sure. Mel Toll with Lee Development in downtown Silver Spring. Good morning. Good morning, Ralph.
And another Annie Foster.
Good morning, everyone. Annie Foster Ahmed, Universities at Shady Grove.
Francisco. We'll go back to Francisco. Kyle.
Yeah, this is Kyle Bayless with the Maryland Small Business Development Center at the University of Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. And Tony. Tony Price, can you hear me?
Hi, this is Tony Price. I'm just with MCCC Consulting Group. We're a service saver owned small business providing architecture engineering services. Just listening in.
All right, thank you for joining us. So with that, I will hand it over to the chair of our Economic Development Committee for introductions and to get this meeting going, Ann Kademian. Ann, take it away.
Thank you, Brian. And Brian, I think we're all your favorites. You mentioned Mel was your favorite.
Mel is always a lot of fun on these committees.
Okay. Mel, we're all jealous. All right. So everybody, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's great to have you here. I'm really excited to introduce our guest and grateful for having our guest here today as well. I'm going to, Ralph Hall is a professor at Virginia Tech in the School of Public and International Affairs, former colleague of mine. We built some things together at Virginia Tech. It was a lot of fun. But Ralph is also a leading scholar and author, and I'm going to say innovator in sustainable development for water supplies, for transportation, farming, agricultural development, and what we're going to talk about today, economic and industrial development as well. And I want to emphasize innovator when I introduce Ralph, because academics, and I'm an academic as well from way back. While we're bursting with great ideas, we're not always the ones who are leading the change that the ideas can inspire. But Ralph is one of those rare scholars who brings ideas and research to life in creative and really remarkable ways. I just have to tell a story. I don't know if you all remember the Google glasses. Do you remember those? The glasses that you could Google the world with. Ralph was one of the first ones to test those out, right? Ralph was wearing the glasses in class and taking pictures with the glasses and all kinds of amazing things. So he's always on the cutting edge of where technology and ideas can mean great things for students learning and for really changing the world as well. So let me give you an example. After completing a major research project that Ralph was working on with a team of students from Virginia Tech, but also from a university in Malawi, as they were leaving Malawi, literally flying out, the library of the local university where they were partnering, the Mzuzu Library, caught on fire and burned to the ground because its servers had overheated. And, Ralph didn't just leave and feel bad about it. Ralph initiated a massive book drive to repopulate the library. The School of Public and International Affairs building in Blacksburg was like, the central hub for all these books coming that Ralph had orchestrated, and then led the effort with people at Virginia Tech and others to try to get this library rebuilt. So the library is coming back as well. So, Ralph builds community, he takes ideas, he sees them through, he's an innovator. And, whether it's in food production or water supply, Ralph's research takes him to application and to innovation. And that brings us to today. So today we're going to learn from Ralph about this concept called community wealth building. And it's not a brand new idea, but it's become increasingly popular as we're struggling with sustainability and equity across the United States and the world. And community wealth building is a sustainable framework for economic development and what we might look like today for what it might mean for Montgomery County, right? We had Ralph here at Shady Grove a couple of weeks ago leading a workshop on USG's own approach to community wealth building and what that means. It was a very exciting workshop, generated a lot of interesting ideas that we're going to try to take to fruition as part of our strategic plan as well. And again, Ralph is one of the few scholars in the world that is deeply engaged in this alternative frameworks for equity and sustainability as they apply to the economy. And he's going to have some really impressive and interesting data and great examples to challenge our thinking and hopefully start a conversation here in Montgomery County about community wealth building. So with that, Ralph, I think you're going to talk with us for about a half an hour or so and then open it up for conversation. Is that right? So welcome, Ralph, and take it away.
Thanks, Anne. It's a real pleasure to be here. And just looking at the list of organizations that are represented today, if you bottled up this group, you would have the kind of, I think, the core hub for a community wealth building initiative right here, right? So I'll come back to this, I think, at the end of my remarks. I'm going to drop in here a link. Hopefully that would take you to the slide deck here. It's on Google Slides. What I try to do with these presentations is make sure that everything that is shown is you can click on it and it takes you to the original source. So this is sort of partly designed as a database of information. So if you see something you like or you want to read more about, just click on it and hopefully it will take you to where the original source is. So what I will do is sort of walk you through my sort of pathway, I guess, to community wealth building. For the past, I would say 20 years, I've been really looking at the idea of sustainable development. And I've been just taking me all over the world into sort of some of the poorest communities in developing countries, and also to advanced country sort of transportation systems. I'm now looking at energy systems here in the US in terms of the solarization of Virginia. What's interesting is community wealth building is sort of the approach which sort of pulls everything together that I've been doing across the world in all these different places. And so that's why I feel that it's a very interesting idea. And the nice thing about it is it takes the form of whatever the community wants it to take, right? So it's based upon principles and approaches, and you adapt that to your circumstances. So what I'm going to do is just walk through sort of some of the rationale for why I believe it's really important. And I'll do this relatively quickly, and then I'll give you examples of how different places around the world have leaned into this approach. So I'm going to begin with some discussion of the classic, the champagne curve here, and I'll come back. I'm just going to hide my video panel so I can see what I'm looking at. Okay, here we go. So back in 1989, this was around the time sustainable development hit the sort of international stage. So 1992 was the Rio Summit on sort of environment and development. And in the run up to that, people were looking at, well, how are we doing in terms of development? And at that point, about 83%, estimated 83%, had 83% of the world's sort of distribution of GDP was going to 20% of the population. So just remember those numbers, 20% of the population, about 83% of the wealth. So then the question is, where are we today? And so if you take a snapshot of today, you can see in the orange here, this is the population, and then the blue is wealth. So what you see here is about 12% of the world's population now own about 84% of the wealth. So now you've got an enhancement of concentration of wealth. So this, if you can see the graphs, sort of the population on the far right, the vast majority of people, over 50%, basically have about 1% of access to the world's wealth. Now, on top of that, we have the pandemic that came along. And if you look at what happened just in the year 2020, because of all the challenges with labor lost globally about 3.7 trillion in terms of lost income. At the same time, as you may remember, the economy was still tracking up. And so what happened to billionaire wealth at the same time is it increased by about $3.9 trillion. Now, this process of concentration of wealth has been happening for many years before the pandemic. So this is a report that was done by Oxfam. It was looking at the year 2017, and essentially what it said is this headline: the richest 1% of the global population took home about 82% of the wealth created in that year. So this is, and this 82 number is sort of 82, 83 just seems to be appearing in different forms, but it gives you the sense that this wealth concentration is happening year on year. Now, if you look at the US, 1% of the population owns about 1/3 of the wealth, 10% owns about 2/3, the next 40% owns basically the rest, and the bottom 50% has about 3% of the wealth in the US. So, you know, this is really the big challenge that community wealth building is starting to address. How do we create new mechanisms that can really enhance the wealth of those in the bottom half of the US population here in our country? Now, this graph is one which I find very helpful to kind of explain conceptually what I believe is going on. So you can see here tracking from the 1950s, if you look at the x-axis, 1950s up into about, you know, the mid sort of 70s, 80s. This is where everything tracked together as labor productivity, GDP was going up, private employment and family income also tracked. And then you had a shift in what happened. You know, this is sort of, you can think about the Thatcher, I'm from England, so the Thatcher, Reagan administrations, privatization, the whole range of sort of changes were happening at that time. And this led to this decoupling where GDP continued to increase and productivity did, but job prospects and median family income sort of flattened out for many decades. And so if you look at the big picture, if you look at the bottom graph here in blue, this is wages as a percent of GDP. And it was relatively stable during the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, but on a slow decline. And then we had in the year 2000 this sort of drop off. And, you know, this year 2000 was when China joined the World Trade Organization around there. So I think there's an element of globalization here. But this trend is not just a US phenomenon. It was happening in about 42 of the 59 countries that were included in this study. At the same time, that money goes somewhere. So it's going to capital, going to corporate profits. So there's a lot of factors. I mean, one of the things I've been doing is looking at sort of this trend in multiple different ways, right? So you have, I mean, we have a book in its second edition here on sort of technology, globalization and sustainable development, and how do you transform the industrial state? So a lot of this work comes from this sort of textbook. But one of the things I've been trying to do is look at what's happening here. Like, why is this happening? And for a while, the general argument was that it's about 1/3 sort of trade, financial openness, 1/3 automation. You know, there's a 1/3 labor union decline, sort of which was preventing workers from claiming a greater share of the productivity that they were supporting. But more recent work, this has come out of MIT last year, is now pointing to the fact that maybe 50 to 70% of changes in wage structure over these sort of past 4 decades can be accounted for by declines in workers that are doing routine tasks in industries that are rapidly going through automation. So it may be actually that automation, this is not AI, that's a whole new sort of type of displacement that could be on the horizon. This is sort of classic automation of systems. So there's clearly a challenge here, because if wages are the way we broadly distribute income, wealth to our population, and that mechanism is declining or is lower than we think it should be, we need to think about other ways to address this. And if it's not wages, then ownership becomes key. And this is why I'll come back to that concept in a moment. Just looking at the more recent data, this is the same share of compensation going to labor is about a 5% decline. You can see in the last several years on the bottom right of that curve, it's sort of stabilized. So one question that I was always thinking about, which was fortunately answered by some other academics was, you know, what would income look like today? And the study was in 2018, before the pandemic, if income growth since 1975 had remained as equitable as it was in the sort of first post-war decade. So this is that period here on the bottom left of the curve. So what would have happened to these trends had everything continued to track together, and private employment, median family income would have gone up that same trajectory. So I sort of view this as the lost income that workers did not obtain. And so the answer, what you're looking at in these tables is the 1975 amount in the left-hand column. The middle one is the actual data in 2018. And then the counterfactual is what would have happened had things tracked along the same trajectory. So, you know, the lowest 25% here of workers in 2018 had about 33,000. They would have had 61,000. And if you go to the bottom of that table, you can see that the 1% at the bottom is above 761,000, is above, you know, the 560,000. You can also break this down in terms of who was benefiting and who was not. And so I just highlighted Black men here. You can see that they're about $30,000 off where they would have been had trends tracked. So just in the year 2018, this was about $2.5 trillion not going to workers, just to give you a sense of what this means. So looking over that whole triangle, it's about $47 trillion not going to people through income. And that, I believe, is one of the factors why that bottom 50% is rarely registered in the share of wealth. And it's happened over the past 50 years. And so the question is, what do you do about this? Right? That's one big issue. There's also who has benefited from this period of 1960s through until more or less today. And you can see it's white families in America. And so that's, again, something where community wealth building is very interesting because some of its core roots comes from the civil rights movement. And we can talk about that if there's any interest. Now, I do a lot of work on the environment. So I actually came to this work more so through an environmental lens, but in doing so, was really thinking hard about the combination, the connections between economic activity and the environment. And some of that I can talk later if you're interested about some of the newer work on ecological macroeconomics that we're trying to advance in Europe with some of the academics there that are really pushing the envelope on modeling how changes in the economy can impact both income and change the landscape of environmental impact. And I would say that, on the front of this work, most people talk about the environment, the economy, and society. We actually put employment here, not society, because what we realized is that employment is fundamental to sustainable development. And I can go off and talk about a whole range of things on that point, but it's employment that we do as labor, through our labor, but also the employment of the capital that we own. And I can talk more about those economic ideas later. So I think you're probably very familiar with the environmental challenges we face, but just a couple of, if you look at the top two points on the top right here, you'll see that we've lost 50% of our natural ecosystems. So just let that absorb. We've lost 50%, of our natural ecosystems because of development, essentially. And now that's putting species at risk of extinction. And if you look at some of the trends, you see this upward tracking of extinction. And the concern here is between 0 and 2, if you look at 2 near the top of this curve, that's kind of within the background noise of natural species extinction. But we're now pushing into the human-caused extinction. And so this graph can be put alongside all of the great acceleration graphs, right? So you may have seen something like this before. I've been talking about GDP in terms of the inequality problem, but arguably the development we've seen has been driven primarily by energy. There's some really interesting academics that argue that it's actually innovation in energy technology that fueled all of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, like the vast majority of what was possible was because we could get more energy out of each unit of energy input. So the return on energy from sort of extraction and those kinds of efficiency technologies kept improving, and that fueled the Industrial Revolution. And now we're beginning to plateau. So unless we have some major energy breakthrough, we're going to have some trouble in the long-term continuing growth. But obviously that energy use created a significant amount of environmental pollution. Climate change is one, but there's also all of our environmental regulation. The vast majority of it is containing toxics. It's toxic regulation, essentially. So this economic activity is sort of spewing out essentially toxics. Climate change is some of the more recent sort of ideas. In the 90s it came around. Before that, in the 70s, you may sort of remember the kind of Toxic Substance Control Act. And so we were targeting toxics early, and we've just added climate change to the latest list of issues that this relates to. So when you try and sort of put these ideas together, what you see, we talked about the left, 12% of the population essentially owning about 84% of the wealth. The top sort of richest 10% of the population is related to about 50% of CO2 emissions worldwide. So you can actually target. You could do very strategic targeting of solutions to try and solve this, but you can see who's largely responsible for much of the impact here. Now, there's a whole range of people who are putting ideas forward. And if you haven't heard of Donut Economics or Kate Raworth's work, this is a good place to go look and see what they're doing. They have a nice sort of donut-shaped concept here with the social indicators on the inside, the sort of social foundation. That's the inequality problem I'm pitching. And then the external, the sort of 9 biophysical limits are the environmental concerns that we need to keep an eye on. And as you can see, we're already exceeding 4 of these, maybe more, and we're not doing very well on the social foundation. So I would pitch the critical challenge that we absolutely have to spend all of our time sweating, essentially, is how do we address inequality without putting further pressure on planetary boundaries and actually reducing the pressure. We cannot just sustain where we are because we're already exceeding. We need to actually downscale impact. And so it's very, very difficult to do this. So because of these type of trends that I've mapped through quickly, we've also had multiple financial crises. We've had COVID, we've got a war happening in Ukraine. There's a lot of people now globally thinking very hard about new economics. And so there's quite a few different ideas which I've been tracking. Degrowth, binary economics are ones which I'm sort of in the last sort of several years, 10 years, really looking hard at those. But community wealth building is a nice approach in the sense that it touches on many of these ideas. And I just put here, when you start looking at these ideas, they look at technological progress slightly differently, perhaps. They have all targeting a decrease in consumption of products and services that are destructive to the environment and an enhancement of those that are not. So if you're thinking about wealth building, build wealth in those goods and services that have zero or very limited impact on the environment. Work week issues are there, and then obviously there's different ways of addressing distribution of wealth or income, either through some kind of basic income guarantee or other mechanisms, which I can talk about later. So looking at who we have in this room, I think most people are very familiar with this idea of the linear economy. We need to move away from that. And there are some interesting ideas about regenerative design. And regenerative design, people say, well, what is that? If you think back to the top corner graphic of ecosystems and 50% declining from where they were pre-development, essentially, that's what it's all about. It's how do we start to rebuild our ecosystems while also living within them. And it goes from molecule in the middle, green chemistry of that diagram, all the way up to international multilateral collaboration and frameworks. And so, as a city, you can see yourself in the diagram here, but it's the city down to the molecules in your city and tracking everything that's happening. This I think is the future of all academia. Like, we need to look at this whole puzzle and think about what can we do. So think beyond sustainability to regeneration. So that's the challenge I'm pitching, I think, today, and that's why I think community wealth building is interesting, because it gives us a way to begin the conversation. So what is it? So essentially, it's many things, and I'll give you a few different definitions here to try and anchor some of the core principles. So it's placing control of wealth in the hands of locally rooted forms of business enterprise, with ownership vested in community stakeholders. The idea is you're trying to keep investments rooted and local as much as makes sense and is possible. It's a whole system approach. That's why when I mentioned I'm very pleased with how many different actors are in this conversation today. It will take everybody in this room, this Zoom room, to do this. It's not something that can just happen by one group saying I'm doing it, because the forces of the system, the sort of tidal forces you're up against, will just wash you away. So you need to have everybody sort of understanding the basic principles. And I'll show you some examples and how different actors in different places have led the change, right? It doesn't have to be the same model everywhere. So it's looking at different alternative setups, different approaches, different relationships between one another that may not have been in place before. You can see at the bottom here, it talks about resetting social relations, building new politics, right? So your legislative committee, infrastructure committees, there may need to be a shift in how the conversations have been framed from the past, right? To really push for a new kind of thinking. So if you want to read more about this in different forms, if you click on any of these links, you'll see sort of different ways of thinking about these ideas. I'd recommend this one. It's more of an, I like it because it's more academic, but it does talk about the good and bad. So it's more balanced, I would say, but it does a good job of explaining some of the differences between the different approaches that it covers in the book. The term community wealth building really can be traced back to the work of the Democracy Collaborative. And we've been Anne and I have been in conversation with a number of the people from this group. And maybe they'll be connected with something that could happen in your region if things start to advance. And again, you can see here the types of elements. So community land trusts, worker cooperatives, public banking if available, supercharging the power of these entities and trying to target investments that really enhance the economic opportunities given to people in the communities. It requires local government. It requires economic development teams in anchor institutions such as USG and community leaders and organizations. So again, this is why this group is so, I think, fundamentally important if this idea is something you'd like to consider. Here's just a quick snapshot of conventional versus community wealth building. If you look at place, are there assets underutilized in your community that could benefit the community in some interesting way? Ownership is key. How do you promote different ownership mechanisms so you begin to root the wealth in your community so it sticks, it sort of doesn't drain out? Collaboration, multiple players are needed, which creates a transaction cost around this. So do you have to sort of be honest up front and say, well, this is not necessarily going to be an easy thing. It takes probably a decade to get close to any significant transformational place, right? But I think the ideas which you'll see, if you look down the list of the conventional to the community wealth building, you'll probably see areas where you're already working and you're already doing this. And so I think it's not a complete 180. It's actually saying, okay, we're already doing this, but how do we do more in a coordinated, strategic way? So let's look at a few quick examples. So Cleveland, the Grady University Circle Initiative here, essentially they had about $3 billion invested. You can see the anchor institutions listed in goods and services. But the neighborhoods, residents had a persistently high level of unemployment, and they were realizing they weren't serving the people in their local community. So what they did is they started to say, well, we could buy locally. We could actually combine the elements of our procurement that makes sense. We can target that. We can create the demand and target that. We can hire locally through cooperatives that will form and essentially start supporting things locally as best as we can. It's not 100%, it's what makes sense. And that's the most important thing to take away. So what happened in Cleveland was a very intentional design of cooperatives, and I'll show you those in a moment. Another really important point of this is that the whole process was made possible because of this Economic Inclusion Management Committee. So there was this sort of group that came together that had more than one anchor institution represented. It was a trusted central player with money and clout and sort of political influence that could say, we need to do this, we need to move on this. And I'll come back to this sort of need for this kind of entity towards the end of my remarks today. So what they did is they intentionally created evergreen cooperatives, and they did this through a whole range of activities. The gist of it is taking a proportion of the multi-billion-dollar annual business expenditures from anchor institutions, targeting them at activities that can be served by new evergreen cooperative businesses. Now let's have a look at those. So you've got a laundry service, obviously critical for a hospital, and not just any laundry service, but a cost-effective, state-of-the-art laundry service that's won many awards. They're growing food in the city. So the farm to fork distance, instead of being hundreds of miles, is a mile, it's very short. So you can see not only are they doing nutrient-rich, pesticide-free food for the anchor institutions and beyond, but there's also sort of transportation impacts. And obviously I do sustainable transport, so I like the idea of removing that distance. They're also looking at energy solutions, and because obviously these anchor institutions need energy to operate. And beyond that, they've now moved into a fund to enable privately held enterprises to transition to some kind of cooperative model. So they'll finance that transition so employees can own the business. So that's an example of Cleveland. The Preston model in the UK is also seen as one of the sort of leading examples of this. It started because they had a loss of in this case, they called it an anchor store. It's a classic development through a shopping mall. Essentially, it disappeared from the horizon, so they needed to rethink. What they did is they looked at a sort of social economic strategy that's based on innovation and creativity. So, I mean, Anne was talking about the need for innovation up front. Community wealth building should not be seen as something that's not cutting edge and innovative. It absolutely has to be for this to work. And you could kind of see that in the cooperatives in Cleveland, winning awards, they're not just creating services, they're creating services using the best practices that we are aware of. In this case, it was the city council that led the change. It wasn't in Cleveland, it was the anchor institutions, the hospital, academic. Here it was the city that led the charge. So again, a different model of how this works, but very similar types of approaches were discussed. There was a need for anchor institutions to target their procurement where it makes sense locally. Everyone in the network committed to paying a living wage that was certified by the Living Wage Foundation. They were targeting the creation of cooperative networks of workers. Public finance is also something they're trying to create, a public bank, like what we have here, the Dakota Bank in the US. And there's also a university center, and I believe we have an equivalent in some of the participants here of a small medium enterprise sort of center focusing on how do you create these new entities to serve the demand. So again, in this case, you can see cooperation is key. Although it had a political sort of leadership, the arguments that you read around it is it took everybody, but in this case, it was started from a different place, a different point. Some quick data. Before they did this, Preston City was doing 5% of its procurement locally. It moved to 18%. So you're not talking 80% shift. It was a relatively small shift, but a relatively impactful shift. As a county, it went from 39 to 79, and that was pretty significant. Unemployment dropped. And because of the skills that were needed and the efforts to create new enterprises, there was, in the UK, an above average improvement in health, transport, adult skills in this region because of this intentionality behind what they were doing. So I won't go through all these, but the arguments you'll see in this kind of material is community wealth is where we start with the next kind of economic transformation. And if you read the small print there, it's about taking the first steps towards really transforming the economy so it works for everybody. That's the key. It needs to work for everybody. So we have to move away from this. We need to move into this type of much more complex, interconnected thinking. But you could do this without thinking about ownership. And you absolutely have to think about who will own this system that we create, right? So it's the ownership of this system is absolutely critical. And it can take different forms. But if you don't think about the architecture of the flow of money, and you just think about the engineering sort of physical, visual architecture, you're missing half the problem, right? I would say this diagram without ownership is the environmental problem. If you bring in the flow of money, you're now looking at the inequality problem at the same time. There are many ways that you can sort of visualize this. It's not a model. People call it the Preston model. It's really an approach. It's a general approach that you can take. So if you look at the Cleveland model, it was the university and hospital here in the kind of mustard color that just shifted its purchases to intentionally created cooperatives. It was a bit more rigid, sort of blueprint-like model, right? So that's how I would characterize what they did. Local government was the lead in Preston. So if you look at the teal color lines here, you can begin to see where Preston was active. You know, it was supporting the creation of local cooperatives. You can also then think about money. In Preston, money is critical. So I'll come to money in a second, but the worker cooperatives, the idea is you're trying to give people economic opportunities through work and through ownership of the enterprise they're a part of in the local economy that's serving the needs of local businesses and institutions. And then the financing question is also really critical. How does that work? Preston is trying to create a public bank. You can look at credit unions. You can look at pension funds investing locally. So have conversations with pension funds. Where are you investing your money? Is it going locally? So you can begin to see this whole system. I like these diagrams because it gives you sort of ideas of how the system interconnects and how do we need to create sort of economic opportunities for those people that currently don't have them. So I'm about to wrap up, but if you're looking to learn more, there's many places where you can look. You can go to Preston and see what they're doing. There's sort of a Community Wealth Building 2.0 report you can read. It's quite easy to get through. Preston would not have done what they did without the support of the Center for Local Economic Strategies. That center sort of is the hub and curator of community wealth building in the UK. So go to that center, click on the image on the bottom right, it will take you there. And they've produced many reports like the Preston one I showed earlier, but they've talked about different ownership models of the economy as well. So again, lots of different resources available. Here in the US, this is the Municipal Policies for Community Wealth Building report 2020 that came out of New York City. And you can sort of get a sense here of the global potential of this idea, where it's happening. You've got Italy, you've got Seoul, you've got Barcelona, you've got Baltimore, you've got, it talks about the North Dakota Bank in 54, that I mentioned just a moment ago. So this is a good report to look at. And what you can see in the quote that, domestic and international strategies outlined offer insights for how the city of New York's vision of economic inclusion can be advanced. So again, it's a set of ideas and principles that coalesce around rooting wealth in community. So a brief summary of the core ideas here, and I'll just bring these all up. Anchor institutions are critical. So USG has taken the lead in your region and put community wealth building as a strategic objective of its institution. And so if you think about the models about Cleveland, about Preston, I believe if you come back in 10 years, if this all advances in some form, the narrative will be USG was the lead initiator of this with support from, and then the question is from who, Like who comes alongside? It can't be done alone. And that's why these conversations are really, really important. So looking down this list, creation of local enterprises, USG, and all of the 9 universities in the Maryland system have some form of probably incubator, is business enterprise, sort of startup capacity, like training and supporting students in that space. Some of that potential capacity can be targeted on this issue, right? So there's a network of potential there that can be tapped. Whenever you create something new, I think the easiest thing to do is ask questions of ownership. How, instead of just doing it the traditional way, how about having a cooperative model or employee stock ownership, the ESOP model? There's also land trusts for housing. I think that's really important in your area, is making sure that housing is affordable. Paying a living wage, invest in people in place. You can, through the diagrams, the maps sort of gives you a visual of how that can happen. And then the last part really goes into this regenerative approach. Like how do we actually increase and enhance our quality of environment, not only just maintain where we are. So coming back to the question I pitched earlier, thinking about your region in general, the question is, who is it in the Montgomery County Chamber of Commerce who could serve as the trusted central players, actors, the kind of the go-to group to start thinking about these ideas if there's something you would like to really think about. So that's it. That's my last slide. And so I can, I'm going to bring back my view here so I can see everybody. And I'll just stop sharing for a moment so I can see the group. Okay, so hopefully that was enough in time. I packed in a fair amount of ideas and raised some questions. So I'll be happy to have a conversation and answer any questions that you may have.
Ralph, thank you so much. That's fantastic. I want to lift up to and highlight Montgomery College. Many of our Montgomery College colleagues are on the phone today. Anything along these lines would be in partnership, and we have many nonprofits here in the region who are also tackling many of these ideas as well. So there should be a lot of good interest in terms of what we're doing, and also Montgomery County Public Schools as a core part of all of this as well. So, Brian, should we just open it up for questions?
Yeah, I think that's what we should do, and I have one if no one else does. So, but let's open the floor for questions.
Actually, I have a question because there's one topic that came up that I've been so focused on, and the chamber is so focused on. So if I may, first of all, I'm absolutely transfixed. This was amazing. I want to go through it all over again from the beginning, because it's once through is amazing, and then there's much more to say here. But there's a big topic that in all the years I've been active in the county, and I was a trustee at the college, and one of the challenges it seemed that big organizations had, anchor organizations, is procurement locally. They'd be buying stuff because they had big contracts, like the university system. Maybe this is all different now, I don't know. But when I was involved back in the day, one of the challenges, and I was often the one that was the skunk at the picnic on this, on the board of trustees, as Susan Madden will tell you. But I would say was, why are we contracting with some California company? Nothing wrong with them. I'm sure they're great. But can't we spend the money in Maryland? Can't we spend it in Montgomery County? And I wonder about other institutions that may not have their central offices. Let me just be really parochial and talk about Montgomery County in Maryland, but who have been acquired. They're here, but they are now part of a larger system, whether it's corporation, could be in healthcare, could be anything. They're buying in huge bulk, and there's all sorts of stuff they don't buy locally. But anyway, I remember at the college in particular that they were stuck with some procurement rules. I mean, they could do a few things, but that buying power, and our chamber is very focused on anything having to do with getting our companies access to procurement opportunities. The federal government is our big entity here. And so we work very hard to connect our companies to those kinds of opportunities, teach them how to get at them and how to manage them, because that's a whole other kettle of fish, if you would. But is the world changing on that, or how do you help? How does a community come together to change those big buying efforts?
Mhm. That's a very, very good question. And it's, I
I
see
might
it.
have an answer for that.
You wanna go ahead?
Oh,
Sorry.
yay.
So,
Go ahead,
so,
and
the,
I'll-
so
I'll
the,
follow
the
up.
answer is changing culture, right? We all have to get in this together. I had a friend who took a recent trip to Tokyo, and he was baffled by the fact that children there drive around the metro and public transit alone, and they wear yellow hats. And the reason why is because as a society, they've decided that the well-being and upbringing of the children supersedes anything else. And so we have to come together as a group of entrepreneurs and shift leaders and mindsetters and trendsetters to foster that culture in the environment. Here at USG, we have the entrepreneurship lab. We try to hire folks who have been through the lab for our events, right? To build this entrepreneurial ecosystem so that they get a chance to also get an experience of what is it like to have a vendor who doesn't who doesn't pay taxes? What is it like to organize an event for 100 people and you have 150 show up? Those types of things. So in short, I believe it's the change of culture, the change of mindset, and getting everyone on the same page about it, and really caring and recognizing why it's important. If we don't swim together, we're gonna sink. So that's my 2 cents. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
Yeah.
that's okay. So procurement, how do we get big institutions to buy locally?
You basically, you begin a conversation and you change the rules. You literally go and change the rules. And so what happened in Preston was they had a critical mass of local government. It was local government led initially, and then other anchor institutions came along and they looked at their procurement. They had a whole study, the Center for Local Economic Development, which they were working with, did a study of procurement. They said, well, let's take a hard look at what you're doing. And then it was data informed. It wasn't just we need to change it. It was looking at exactly what they're spending. They had the data, which I showed earlier, what they were doing before, what they were doing after. And then they started to adjust. They started to put things into their procurement sort of approach. So maybe a 10% weighting on contracts. They broke up their big contracts to smaller sized contracts, so more local entities could basically play in the system, so to speak. And so there was an intentionality there, and it took work to take that on. So that's, I think, if my advice would be is to talk to Preston, talk to them and say, how did you do that? Like literally, how did you get the data and then make the transition in terms of these new contracting sort of percentages on bids? And so what was really interesting, I've been looking and reading and watching videos of people engaged in this process in Preston, and one of the most interesting conversations was from a local contractor who essentially applied and won a contract and then started to think, well, why did I get this in terms of this? What is this local weighting that I benefited from? They started to understand what the whole approach was about. And then they started to internalize that in everything they did. So they started to procure all of the equipment, the hardware that made any sense locally. They started to do that. They gave their workers vouchers to buy food in the local town where they were building something, right? So they started to really embody this approach. And so that's another part of this. It's sort of this domino effect. You set I do a lot of thinking in terms of some of my early work was in regulation-induced innovation for sustainable development. If you look at my Google Scholar stuff, that's the publication that seems to have gained global traction. So how do you induce innovation through regulation? And it connects to the kind of Porter hypothesis up at Harvard saying, you set high standards and people will respond. Innovation will occur. If you don't have a bounded space, what do you innovate for? But as soon as you can sort of tighten the space down, people talk about the idea of opening up the innovation potential of the designer, right? they're able to say, okay, now I've got a bounded problem, I'll solve that. And that's the regulation-induced approach. So I'm coming at this from that kind of perspective. Like if you set the stage with a solid rationale and purpose and explain what's happening, it permeates through the system. And so I think procurement is sort of one space. It's one absolutely critical, important starting place. But there's others as well. You know, once you've done that, then the response to that procurement needs to be there. Right. So if you don't have the response, you know, and this is where the sort of incubator, small, medium enterprise, startup support, all of those capabilities need to be up and running around the same time. So when the demand is put in place, that there are enterprises that are available. Cleveland was very, very intentional. It's more like a blueprint planning process. I think you would have, given what I know so far, I think you already have many of the local enterprises probably in place. So it's another place would be to document everything you have in your community and start working with them to say, do you know about this approach? You know, how is your enterprise owned? Is it one person or is it broadly distributed ownership, whatever model that is, cooperative or employee stock ownership? And who has the capacity to educate those groups on these different models? One final thing, and I know there's a question. There was an interesting study about it's towards the end, I believe, of my slides, and it's in the supporting slide number 51. If you have to click on the link, I'll put the link back in because I think maybe some people may have joined after I put it in. So slide 51, there's this, the membership of unions is going down. You know, it's about 14 million members in labor unions in 2020. Employee ownership of companies is going up. There's now 14 million people sort of owning their enterprises. And there's this discussion about what they've termed the silver tsunami, as the sort of baby boomers retire and then leave the question on the table is the ownership of these enterprises they spent their life creating. There's an opportunity here to maybe have about 400,000 businesses shift to different modes of ownership. And there's a lot of people working on that. So that could impact maybe 2 to 4 million workers nationally. So I think there's sort of, again, a lot of factors to consider here. But what I'm primarily interested in is whatever we do has to dramatically reduce environmental impact and dramatically enhance the potential income that basically the average person, the average worker can gain from engaging in whatever they're doing. So long answer, but
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Denise, you have a question?
I do, thank you. So I love this. Thank you so much. Again, I work for Holy Cross Health, and my job is really about community building and trying to improve the health and well-being of our community. So trying to do a lot of this work within my work. My question is, for an organization like us, we're a not-for-profit, we have a long-term commitment to the community, but not every business does in that same way have that, you know, they clearly have an economic motive. So I'm wondering if there is good evidence that in places like Cleveland or Preston, where you can show that doing this has in fact expanded the GDP, not just shifted where the money is going. Is that research available? And I think it could be very compelling in trying to make this a good for your business as argument.
that's a great, I mean, so I don't have it at my fingertips. I think there would be, there are some studies in the sort of the books, I'm not sure you can see it, the one I mentioned about the, you know, it's the Preston model and community wealth building. It's more of an academic read on how this works. You know, there are people who argue, like in Cleveland, you've got this bubble of really interesting community wealth building, but what happens outside of it, right? You know, Cleveland, they have a number of challenges still. And so there's many ways to answer your question, right? So there's this whole degrowth movement. And this is more European and Latin American. And the idea is essentially, it's not what's related to COVID. Some people say, well, the economy's ramped down and that's degrowth. And it's not. What degrowth is a sort of intentionality around shifting our focus away from the heavy resource intensive activities and maybe taking on a sufficiency agenda, like what is enough, as opposed to more is better, right? So that there's different ways to answer the question, right? So one way is, well, maybe we actually do need to challenge the question of growth in some of this. But you can do that. One of the things that we've been thinking about in this degrowth question is really the question is not degrowth, it's how do you deconstruct growth? Because growth is highly complex and multifaceted, and there are things that you actually must grow, and there are things that we want to intentionally degrow. So there's a nuance there. And I'm not really answering your question, but I'm trying to explain why it's hard for me to answer the question, because what I would want to do is say there are things that I'd actually say we shouldn't continue growing, but we need to grow into these other things, which may be things that are already happening and you want to ramp up. And so the question, it might be a wash, it might be a balance, right? You may actually have around about the same economic activity, but what's happening in the engine of that economic activity is beginning to fundamentally shift. And so that, I think that what I would try and say is we want to see these types of regenerative types of economic activity, which are enhancing the potential of communities, supporting community space, community use of assets, building that community that or just supporting that community that you're working with in ways that they may not have had support in the past. And so the final thing I'll mention is that the question of GDP, I mean, from a sustainability perspective, there's many people have been working on this fact that we just need to measure holistically many other things. So GDP goes up if you buy an alarm for your house, right? Yeah. But that's the symptom of, social problems, not what we would like to see in terms of progress. So it's sort of I would shift what we're measuring is one response, measure different kinds of things which we value and deem important. And that is where the conversation begins. So you'll tend to see some of that in the community wealth building literature in terms of how do you measure the impact? And it's ground up, it's bottom up, and it's also well-being. Just a question of has people's well-being improved? Are they happier in this community now than they were before? Which is not in any mainstream sort of conversation right now. So it's a great question. I mean, I think that's part of this process would be to try and document and capture very well what's happening. But I can have a look around and see if there's anything that I can find that gives you, I mean, I have a lot of material. I'd have to go back in and look at and say, read this. This is a good example of citywide impact example of this approach. Preston's probably the best place for that.
Thank you.
And I saw Lowell and then Francisco.
Thanks.
Yeah, a lot to think about on this topic. I guess my question centers around, for lack of a better word, kind of sense of urgency. Because I look about this concentration of wealth and the concentration of power. I'll call it the establishment. So I've been in banking for 35 years or whatever. So I probably consider myself a representative of establishment. I think there's a lot of forces that would not be so ready to jump to a sense of urgency to change. It seems like, because if you're already a part of that establishment, you have that concentration of wealth and power, are you going to be one of these anchor institutions? Because what is the alternative, right? I think about certain communities where that sense of urgency to do something is probably more apparent than others because of whatever the conditions that you just outlined. But I think there's lots of forces that would take lots of, I mean, I even just think of over the years, private equity, talk about ownership of private equity has come in, and it used to be, it was fairly rare, and now it's dipped way down into what would be considered smaller middle market companies. And as that concentration, I'm sure, just continues of that wealth, it just revisits itself over and over again. But I guess that would be the sense of urgency around an establishment who may not be quite as ready to embrace this type of change, and even politically, right? Yeah.
Right. Well, it's a great question, and having spent my academic career on the fringe of pretty much everything I touched, I know exactly what you mean in terms of, if you look at sort of the innovation literature, what you find is it's the periphery, the fringe, that eventually becomes the center of the new, right? So you have these kind of disrupting ideas and concepts emerge, and they're out there for a while, but as soon as they become sort of widely understood and competitive in terms of their sort of power, there's a shift. What I'm seeing, it's one of the biggest problems is the sort of the first mover who's going to do this, and how do you position this in a way that is, and it goes back to the prior question as well, necessarily non-threatening to established enterprises, and that's very hard, but I think there are ways that it can be done. If you think about, I work with, my job is education, so I'm working with students all the time, and I've been really shocked when I first, so if you think about their whole education, it's been in the traditional way of thinking, largely, right? They've gone economics 101, they've done, like, this is how the capitalist system works, and then they come into a class and you start presenting these ideas in detail for a semester, and it ignites, they're ignited. This is sort of what they are looking for. And it's sort of, it gives a space for them to explore ideas which they have sort of sensed the need for, but didn't really know where to go because they weren't hearing it in any of the classes. So, in Europe, there's a degrowth degree now in Barcelona in Spain, and it's taught by 3 or 4 of the top thinkers in this space. We don't have anything like that in the US. So the part of the problem is we're just not, part of the problem is us, like academics. We're not really laying the foundation. And this is why working with USG and the students there and here at Virginia Tech in this sort of project where we sort of are thinking about how do we, and when Anne and I spoke earlier, it's like we have to bring the students with us. Like, this can't be Anne and I and the administrators of our institutions. It has to be student driven as well. And I can see that interest will begin to translate into the workforce. So the question is, I think this is why it's a years, maybe decades long process. But I see that there is a movement among the current cohort of students that are not buying cars. They're just not doing what we probably did when we were their age. They're looking for alternatives. They're looking for a light impact on the planet, and they understand these ideas. In terms of the sort of the question of ownership is interesting, because if you root ownership of new enterprises in workers, you've structurally changed the system, right, from the floor up. So there's that component which could push some of the transformation along. I've been looking at this idea of binary economics, which I won't go into here, but it's essentially, how do you finance growth in a way that broadly distributes ownership upfront? It's not asking people to sort of buy into shares or capital using their wage income. It's looking at this, the basic premise is capital pays for itself out of its future earnings. How do you leverage that idea to have a broadly distributed ownership economy? Actually, just historically, this goes back to people who are behind the ESOPs. So those of you who know employee stock ownership programs, that's binary economics, but a first baby step in that space. So I was initially looking at this idea and ended up connecting with Dr. Virgil Wood, who was explaining he was trying to convince Dr. Martin Luther King to do this idea behind the Poor People's Campaign. So instead of marching on Washington, you march on Wall Street. It's the economics. The economics is the problem, right? And so that conversation was happening several months before his assassination, and then it sort of didn't go anywhere after that point. So I've been working with Dr. Virgil Wood, who's now in his 90s, around that idea of revisiting that kind of conversation. What would have happened had we, instead of having a wealth concentration and then redistribution agenda that we have today, you have a pre-distribution of economic sort of development growth over time. And so everyone has an ownership stake in the economy. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about the economy. And it's a very, very fringe idea. And so I spent about 15 years having conversations with people about this. And it's fascinating because we're trained in a certain way. There's sort of like, there's this diagram when you see two faces or a vase. You see that kind of the outline of two faces is in sort of black, and then in the middle is the vase. Binary economics is the vase. You have to intentionally stare at the white space to see the new potential, because the faces are what dominate. And so I'm not really answering your question, but what I'm trying to say is it's really, we have to sort of present an opportunity, understanding that those who are looking at what you're presenting are looking at it with a very different understanding of the world than what you're trying to present to them. And if you understand that, it does begin to open up sort of different kinds of conversations. You have to sort of empathize. Like, it's not that they don't believe what you're saying, it's that they have to unlearn 20, 30 years of what they've been told is good. And so I always say to my students, I put a question mark on some of my classes, is growth good? That's it. And we just go and we have a conversation for a session. And the answer is, it really depends. It really, really depends. Growth is terrible in its current form. We will not live on this planet for much longer if we keep doing what we're doing. So in that context, growth is very bad. But in the community wealth building context of growing into the spaces we need to grow into, it's a good thing. So again, context is really important. So it's sort of a conversation. You need to engage and just put the time in. And even then, the legacy of your education and everything you do, it comes into the question, and it's hard to see. So I can talk later if there's time about some of the work we're doing in Italy, which is really taking this question on at the national level. But I know there's one other question, so I wanted to go back to what you're interested in talking about.
And thank you, Ralph. Francisco.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Francisco Cartagena. I am the program coordinator for USG's Entrepreneurship Lab. Some of the points that were raised were some of the actions that we're already being involved in and engaging. And so unlike some of you, I am not a teacher, but rather an awakener. And so what we are doing is sort of picture a guy with a machete trailblazing through a jungle of conventional way of thinking and systems. But we're also learning along the way from some of our partners. We met yesterday with one where we are developing an actionable workforce development pathway that would also potentially increase enrollment at USG and increase exposure to the Equity Incubator, which is the program that we run here currently in the lab. One of the challenges that they share that they've been facing, because we're not the first ones that they've met with to sort of bring these interns that they are paying, that they just need to have hands-on administrative experience and coaching for, is the barriers that employers have been putting up. And so they were very happy when the lab said, nope, we'll welcome any and all of them. And we can even have a rotation system so that as many people as we can host can be here working and getting the skills necessary. And these are the folks that, perhaps haven't been able to finish the degree because they're working or adult learners, the folks that have families or started families and have just not had the connection. It's very impressive to see the students here or community members come by. And when we share with them that USG has its own scholarship pool and that all they need to access that pool to apply is to be enrolled in one course, it's almost like you open a new world to them. And so connecting and informing folks is at the core of what we're doing, but also taking action in some of what's already in place and not being afraid to trailblaze. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what's going on here. And if you ever want to chat more or learn about all the other initiatives, happy to connect. But it is a real challenge when you sort of have to learn how to navigate that jungle, for lack of a better word. But
Thanks, Francisco. Ralph, I didn't know if you wanted to respond. Oh, Annie's got her hand up. Annie?
Hello, everyone. I'm with Student Services here at the universities at Shady Grove. My question is about engaging public schools in this work. I didn't, in any of the models, I don't think I saw that being discussed, and I didn't see that being talked about. Because for me as an educator, I believe that to sustain, when we're talking about the sustainability of this, you also have to change mindset. And if we're talking about a 10-year plan, we're talking about starting with some of these young people and changing the mindset of young people, that this is the way that we want to move forward, especially in our county. So I didn't see, and I wanted to know, are there models, or have the models reach down to the public school systems in those spaces, or how are they working with the public school systems? In our county, Board of Ed is like 50% of the budget. So there is a huge financial impact to county if we start to think about how they are using their dollars, right? Are they procuring with local? That's big. So I'm not sure like what's happening with that, and how we are talking about the young minds that we want to raise up with this new mindset.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Annie. I think there's kind of two ways I think about this. One is the procurement piece, which you mentioned, right? So schools can certainly be a part of it. They should be a part of the anchor conversation because they are an anchor institution. So bringing them into, I mean, I think again, it's the model that you could develop is to just to lead in the way that that's done, right? Bring the school community in, have a conversation about this, anchor it on the access to nutritious food that's grown locally from environmentally sound, pesticide-free processes, right? You can begin to see how that conversation could unfold. Energy systems as well. Are there opportunities to have cooperatively owned energy, school-owned energy systems, solar power units on the roofs of school if the roof has been recently redone? People are talking about energizing school bus systems to make them electric. So you have electric buses powered by the energy generated on the schools. You now have a whole educational environment as to why are we doing this, right? What is this sort of approach? So I think there are programs in place that will fund these types of ideas. So that's the kind of the action space. But on the education space, what's really fascinating is when I was doing my PhD, there was a professor called Jay Forrester who came up with, I don't know if anyone's heard of system dynamics. He created the field of system dynamics. And he was part of the original model behind the limits to growth work. So if you ever heard of limits to growth in that book, it had a model in it called world dynamics, I think. And essentially it was predicting that the planet will be in crisis in 100 years. And we're not quite there yet, another 50 years or so, but we're on track. If you go back and look at the original models, we're not deviating that far off. So what Jay Forrester argued, and I had the pleasure of talking with him while he was sort of an emeritus professor at MIT. He basically argued that by the time students get to university, it's too late. That was his argument. So his last era of his life was going back to K-12 and teaching systems thinking to students with the exact same rationale as what Annie mentioned, the need to, from the beginning, talk about systems, complex systems in a way that children can understand, but basically mapping the connectivity between things like economic activity and the environment. So it's really understood. And so I think, yes, there's an educational piece to this that could be really important, and USG and its and the 9 institutions could play a major role in some of that outreach to schools, and also schools taking the lead themselves in this space. So I think there's lots that can be, and Anne's talked about this a lot, this kind of, it's not just university, it's K-12 all the way through to professional person and end of career. And then at the end of career, you still do things in the space because you understand you're part of this community. So it's this whole lifelong sort of journey. And I think what we're saying is we've got to start a bit earlier in terms of what we're currently doing. I mean, some of the work that I mentioned, the work in Italy, and what we're trying to do there is say, there's these macroeconomic models that most governments use, which are input-output sort of based, they're very complex, but they don't connect with the environment, which is fascinating to me. How can we make these national level decisions where we don't have any serious insight from the models in terms of what this investment in certain economic activities will do to resource extraction and pollution from that resource extraction as things are processed. So what they've done in Europe is created this model called Eurogreen, which is system dynamics and input output. So system dynamics, this goes back to the person I just mentioned, and it's this idea of policy portfolio analysis. So what they did is the Green Party in Europe said, we want you to come up with a way so we can analyze the full impact of all of our policies. So they had these sort of a degrowth agenda, they had a short work week agenda, they had a transition to renewable energy agenda. They said, let's map all of this out. So this model is kind of a macroeconomic model, but it also tells you, if you lean into these directions, what's the impact on GDP? What's the impact on climate change and CO2 emissions, methane emissions? What's the resource extraction load that you're going to have to take to meet this new model of a new sort of policy you're trying to implement? So what I'm trying to do is work with them this summer to implement some of the ownership questions. So that the Martin Luther King piece. So what would have happened, or what could happen, if we broadly distribute ownership in this new economic development we want to see occur? That's not in their model yet. So we're hoping to create something that really can sort of embody some of the community wealth elements, but then come to the US eventually. We're starting conversations now with Purdue and other places to say, how do we model the US economy like this, right? How do we show that the 8 regions of the US, because it's very hard to do 50 regions because you'd have many supercomputers to do that. But if you had 8 regions of the US, how could we look at the economic activity and peg that to inequality change and to climate change and to toxic emissions and to resource extraction and see a better picture? And the idea, and we had conversations with a number of economists in DC about how to do this. This model has to be able to compete with the existing models, but then it adds something new. So when you go back to displacement, this is what we were talking about earlier, Lowell's question. My plan is to say, if it works, which is a big if it works, it's not easy. Your models are interesting, but this one gives me more data. This one gives me more information. You can choose which one you'd like to use, right? And it's sort of the idea is you displace, you disrupt, and you move to this new place. And I think that's why we are there, because of the exact question that people, they need to see evidence. They need to see that there's an impact from this change and transformation. It's not that they don't necessarily believe you, but it's very hard to think about it from a student perspective, right? They leave Virginia Tech. They know everything that I've showed in this diagram and many more in this presentation and many more things. And then they go into a corporation and they put their hand up in a meeting with a group of this scale and say, what about this idea? And they immediately get shot down as, what are you talking about? That's crazy. And that's it. There's, unless they're a very courageous person and keep going at it, it's very hard for them to operationalize these ideas. And so that's another reason why I think moving away from just teaching it to working with USG and others and trying to say, let's try and do this, I think is what is motivating a lot of our work, because we want to be able to say, we're trying to create internship opportunities for students right now. right? So they can go and actually keep working on this in a sort of a professional way. And so I think the more we can do that, the more that there are groups on this call who are looking for interns that may want to explore this idea in the context of what you personally do as an organization would be great. And, you know, it's a low stakes beginning where they're not coming in and trying to change everything. They're just coming in trying to understand what you do and how can we find alignment between what your mission is, what these ideas of wealth building are, and maybe they leave with a policy memo to the leadership saying, take a look at these ideas, and that could stimulate something new, right? So baby steps, but also really important steps, but also building the pathways for students so they can leave USG, Maryland system, you know, Virginia system, and actually walk into an environment that doesn't shut them down when they start asking hard questions about where did the profits from our corporation go, right? And where are our pension funds invested? And why do we not have employee ownership? And is there a labor union? And, you know, these are the sort of foundational questions that they're coming out with and starting to ask. So anyway, I could go on for a long time, but I know we're getting close to the end, but great questions. And I'm sorry I can't answer all of them, but I know I'll try and look around and see if I can find more material that could be of use.
Ralph, can people follow up with you if they have additional questions? Can we share? All
Sure.
right.
Yeah.
Ralph, thank you so much. Thank you. This has been a fascinating and you know, so insightful, and really appreciate all the work you put into this today, but all the work you're leading and work you're doing and bringing all of us along as well. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us today as well. And I'll hand it back over to Brian.
Yeah, what Ann said, Dr. Hall, we really appreciate your time with a fascinating, and the word Gigi used, transfixing presentation on these fascinating issues. So on behalf of the Montgomery County Chamber of Commerce and our Economic Development Committee, thank you for joining us, and thank everyone who participated as well for joining us this morning. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And amazing presentation. And thanks everybody for joining us. Your time is valuable. Thank you for spending it with us.
Bye, everyone.
Everyone, take care.